Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, developments in New York today around the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro. He and his wife are accused by the U.S. on drug smuggling charges. He's due to appear in court at the same time. The UN Security Council having a big conversation around what the U.S. did over the weekend and the Trump administration's abduction of Maduro from his country over the weekend. Professor Lyal White is on the faculty of the Gordon Institute of Business Science. Lyal, good evening. Good to talk to you again. I realized there'd been a big American military build-up in the region for some time. I have to say, I was among those who really didn't see this one coming.
Yeah, I think it caught everybody by surprise, Stephen. This is one of those New Year things where maybe if they did it anywhere between the 25th of December and the first week in January, it might go under the radar. But if you've been watching or following the developments in New York today, you can see that the Trump administration is not really hiding any of this. They're making quite a show of things, and they've made Maduro and Mr. and Mrs. Maduro now a great spectacle in New York. And obviously these charges are quite serious. It's literally narco-terrorism, among other things. But we also know that by most measures, and international law experts would consider the operation on the 3rd of January a blatant violation of the UN Charter. But there's a lot more to this, Stephen. It's not a cut and dry case, because I'm sure it will come out that most nations around the world have not recognized Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela.
So, I mean, this is one of the interesting questions. And in fact, the UN Security Council session almost started with that point. I think, I forget the name of the person who was speaking, but it was Professor Jeffrey Sachs, I think, who said for him, the issue needs to be whether what the US did was legal. It shouldn't be about the Venezuelan government and those elections. And you can have that argument forever.
Yes, and we would have that argument forever. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs was just out here in South Africa recently, beating that same drum in opposition to the Trump administration. But you must remember he has a political drum to beat there because he is in constant opposition to the United States. I'm not saying what the Trump administration carried out was a legitimate act. What I'm saying is that maybe over the last 10 to 15 years, while Maduro was literally gutting the economy in Venezuela, and you and I have spoken about this at length over the last 10 years or so, the multilateral institutions around the world that were supposedly protecting Venezuelan citizens sat by the sidelines. And that is probably why we've seen a divided kind of response to this, especially from the Venezuelan opposition, which have mostly applauded this, maybe to the surprise of many, because they are holding the bastions of democracy at hand. I think Kamala Harris put this quite well. She said that Maduro is a brutal, illegitimate dictator, but that does not change the fact that this was an unlawful and unwise decision that was made, especially without a transitional plan in place. And I think that's my biggest concern right now is what is the plan? What is next for Venezuela?
So I want to get to that. I just want to go back another step. How important is Maduro to the government in Venezuela? The sort of current movement which became the current government, been there for a long time, started by Hugo Chavez. It survived his passing. Does it survive Maduro if it does a deal with Trump?
Excellent question, because we all know that Maduro came to power in 2013 at the passing and almost unexpected passing of Hugo Chavez, an enormously charismatic populist leader who really carried out this the socialist revolution, the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. We'll remember that he actually was one of the last heads of state to have visited South Africa during the time of Thabo Mbeki. He addressed the final meeting with the Thabo Mbeki administration back in those days. Yes, he's passing, and with that, the charisma went with it. Maduro took over. He was the chosen successor. And during that time, just to give the listeners an idea of what transpired in Venezuela, over 8 million people, roughly a quarter of the population of Venezuela, fled the country over the last 15 to 20 years. Since 2010, the Venezuelan economy has gone from around $400 billion down to $40 billion.
Sure.
It's 10% of what it was Can you imagine if that happened in any other country around the world? There would be social unrest, in which they've had. Nicolas Maduro's record, or human rights record, and record in democracy, is one that has been investigated by the United Nations and other bodies and other multilateral institutions around the world, and still by many, many nations, not only in the Western Hemisphere, including obviously the United States and many Latin American countries, but most of the European Union. And that was what was very, very interesting with this, was the response from the European Union and European countries. They do not recognize Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president because of his response to the July 2024 elections in that country, where, by all counts, Edmundo Gonzalez won that election by 67% to Maduro's 30%. And that's even excluding the 8 million people that had left Venezuela. So that's a bit of the background and context to Venezuela.
So Trump claims the US will run Venezuela. It's quite a big country. It's millions of people. I mean, yes, 8 million of them have left. It has its own internal dynamics. You're the expert, not me, but I understand there's sort of armed gangs that seem to play a significant role, and I imagine control bits of territory. You would have to put millions of boots on the ground for another country to run it.
Yeah, and that statement, I think they've kind of withdrawn or pulled that back a little. I saw Marco Rubio made an alternative statement. By making that statement, he changed the whole orientation to the extraction of Nicolas Maduro, and this was then, as soon as he said we were going to be running Venezuela, it was regime change, which harks back to previous exploits in Latin America and especially in Central America, and even '89 when they withdrew Noriega out of Panama. But this is a little bit far-fetched. We can't expect the United States to have boots on the ground and reinvent the whole Iraqi scenario once again, because we saw how that turned out. But it's going to be a very, very interesting one, because Donald Trump did not outright support Maria Machado, who, by the way, was the opposition leader and the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize at the end of 2025. And he has not supported Edmundo Gonzalez, and he hasn't supported the vice president at this stage. So we don't have any transitional or democratic transition in place. And this is what the greatest concern is, because obviously, as you mentioned, this is over 27 million people. It's a reasonably sized economy in South America and Latin America, in that Andean region. And it could become a serious security situation for the greater region. Hence the response from the Colombians and the Brazilians at the same time.
Maduro's deputy, she might actually have been sworn in now that I talked to you as president, Delcy Rodriguez, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What kind of position is she in? I know she was also the oil minister, but some people, I am sure, are going to say she helped the Americans, and I presume somebody did.
Well, there certainly were people embedded because they were able to penetrate, I suppose, the impenetrable residents on a military base in Caracas. Not an easy task, Stephen, and not even the CIA and the Delta Force, as they said, could do this. But so the CIA was embedded. They do believe they have local support. I'm not sure whether President Delcy Rodriguez was one of those. She has been vehemently in support of Maduro and the return of Maduro, but many will question now how she's risen up. She was, as you mentioned, she was overseeing the oil sector in Venezuela, which has now become, Venezuela does have the largest known oil deposits in the world, which is part of this whole strategic discussion that Donald Trump has been speaking about. But that wasn't really a massive role that she had, and obviously being the vice president to a dictator like Nicolas Maduro doesn't really put her in the spotlight as often as one would expect. So she didn't wield as much power, and certainly not the charisma of Maduro's predecessor, Chavez.
Professor Lyal White, thanks very much indeed, on the faculty at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. Really appreciate that. Peter Armitage is the CEO of Anchor Capital. Peter, good evening. World markets pretty much taking the abduction of Maduro in their stride. The oil price, I suppose, roughly where it was before all of this happened over the weekend.
I think, Stephen, Venezuela is kind of known as a big oil supplier, but because of the actions and what's happened over the course of the last 5 or 10 years, they've gone down to about less than 1 million barrels a day. So that's in the context of just over 100 million barrels a day in the world. So it's less than 1% of supply. So it's not, they'll probably still carry on supplying oil. So the actual impact in terms of the supply of oil is geopolitically noisy, but economically not that relevant, I guess.
This leads to other questions because, I mean, our fuel price is coming down this week, partly because of a stronger rand, partly because of weaker oil prices. There was a meeting of the OPEC Plus nations, I think yesterday or over the weekend. They seem to suggest they'll keep production roughly where it is because everybody's chasing market share.
Yeah, so the problem is even, the oil prices gradually come down from about $80 to about $60 today over the last 12 months. And when there isn't really any supply or any big buyer to pick up the slack, it tends to gradually come down. Because, and even if OPEC does cut, guys need to carry on supplying to make their cash flows. So it's always, OPEC is about 35% of world supply. That's also something to bear in mind. So the other 65% can move quite a bit. And US shale just continues to increase. So you've got this kind of supply-demand balance where there's a little bit more supply than demand, and that generally results in prices coming off. And it's difficult for them to cut to try and increase the price because A, it won't necessarily increase the price, and B, countries don't particularly want to sell less because they need the cash flows to pay for their own affairs in their own countries.
Is it possible to know how long this will go on for, barring any major shocks? I mean, I've seen some suggestions that, in fact, it could be like this. We could be in a kind of, what do I call it, a benign oil price environment for quite a lengthy period, 5 years even.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing is economic growth and oil intensity from around the world. And the biggest driver, if you go back a few years ago, was China. So their industrial production was resulting in, quite strong growth every year in terms of oil demand. But China's been the biggest player in terms of EV adoption. So their motor vehicles the whole motor vehicle fleet is using less oil. Cars have become more efficient. There's lots more hybrids. And the economic consumption per kind of units of GDP, the oil consumption has come off a bit because there's other energy sources, solar and wind and the like. So it's hard to see global demand for oil being much higher in a few years' time. And global supply likewise. Venezuela, ironically, this could land up with Venezuela producing quite a lot more in a few years' time if Trump has his way.
Well, this is kind of where I'm heading. So, okay, if that happens, got the world's largest reserves of oil, we understand. But Trump says the US will take over Venezuela's oil reserves, essentially. But that will make Venezuela rich. But it won't do that if suddenly you've got a lot more oil on the market, just as demand is going down anyway. And I'm young enough to remember being told that we'll have peak oil and then we'll all have to walk everywhere.
Yeah. So I think Venezuela, in terms of potential, if you look back, it was producing about 4 to 5 million barrels a day, and it's now producing 1. So that was in the 90s. So let's go, it can probably get back to 3 or 4. So that adds another 2 or 3% to world supply, but that will take a number of years to happen. So, yeah, I mean, oil, I think most people are kind of in their forecast pages are looking at a fairly benign oil price for some time. But at $60, people still make a lot of money. So that's why there's an equilibrium in the price. I think it costs the Saudi Arabians about $5 a barrel. The shale guys, there's a huge difference between the low-cost producers and the high-cost producers. But clearly at $60 is enough of an incentive for people to continue putting capex and expenditure into it.
Peter Armitage, thank you very much indeed, the CEO of Anchor Capital.
The Money Show.
The Markets.
Arthur Karras is Portfolio Manager at Old Mutual Investment. Arthur, good evening to you. Not a lot of local news, but quite a few developments, and particularly platinum, starting off with a very strong start to the year.
Yes, we had a strong morning for precious metals as a whole. I think that the platinum companies rebounded somewhat after their slip late last year. I think that could just be people re-looking at the overall situation for the sale of petrol cars and saying it's not going to be as bad as what we think, and we're going to need more platinum and palladium than what we thought.
Gold also, gold surged quite strongly this morning. Reuters put out a report on it. I did think, actually, considering what happened with Venezuela over the weekend, you'd sort of expect that.
Gold hasn't been a great geopolitical hedge over the last couple of cycles. Probably the primary driver for the gold price in the last while has been a lot to do with the US dollar and giving people an alternative to keeping your kind of safe haven money in something other than US treasuries and the US dollar. So I think that will probably continue for the year ahead. No, we're not really expecting the dollar to be a strong currency in 2026, and that should underpin the gold price.
One presumes then some of the predictions about gold last year, $5,000 by the end of this year, we're nearly at 4,500. It would make sense that continues.
Absolutely, and it's a very, very difficult thing to get right. It's not something where you can easily kind of work out a price at which, like a share, work out what it's worth, or calculate a price like what Peter was talking about, the oil price. You've got strong demand supply numbers that you can use to figure out a range for that. With gold, it's a lot trickier. So the more the dollar gets weaker, the more that people feel they want that hedge, the longer it's likely to run. And then,
the rand looking so strong at the moment. As I remember signing off last year thinking it would be very nice if we stay below 17 rand to the dollar. Here we are much of the day around 16.45.
Not really a surprise. If you look at some of the other indicators of the health of the South African economy, South Africa overall, the bond market's been extremely strong. Over the last 2 years, it's gone from 12.5% to now 8.4%, telling you that sophisticated investors are very comfortable with what's happening here. And the rand is, after a regular amount of kind of setbacks as things have happened between South Africa and the US, as an example, last year, people are saying, well, the bond prices or the bond yield is down. We've got a new inflation target, which gives us some confidence that inflation is going to continue to stay under control. We've got a improving fiscal trajectory, so our debt situation is not getting worse. It's stabilizing. There's a potential for it to get better. All of those things are helping support the rand. So not a huge surprise, even though it's sometimes difficult to predict how it plays out.
A lot of optimism towards the end of last year for South Africa, and I'm seeing more signs of that now even. Still, people have maintained their optimism over the holiday.
Well, it comes back to some of the things that we've been discussing already. So the stronger rand, stronger dollar tends to be very good for our banking shares. And some of them have had a reasonable year last year. But in 2025, the economy or the stock market was all about was really all about the precious metal miners and one or two other shares. There wasn't really much action there on the local side. So that still leaves us with relatively cheap banks, retailers, all of which will benefit from lower inflation translating into lower interest rates in South Africa. We're still seeing the benefit of less load shedding coming through. That's a good thing for sentiment. It looks like Transnet is starting to improve. If we look at talk from the companies that use those services, so all of those things helping to improve sentiment and reminding us that our stocks are cheap and emerging markets are doing relatively well right now, and we fit squarely into that bracket of a really investable emerging market.
We're far away from South America. Arthur Karras, thanks very much indeed. Portfolio manager at Old Mutual Investments.
Stephen is on X
at Stephen Grootes.
Well, a series of comments from air traffic navigation services through the day saying the main reason flights were delayed at OR Tambo yesterday afternoon was air traffic controllers were ill or unable to come into work. The problems led to delays for dozens of flights. Airlines themselves, of course, end up carrying a lot of the financial can for that. Lyndon Burns is the managing director of Plain Talking. Lyndon, good evening. ATNS says this happened because some of their workers were sick. Do you think it's as simple as that?
Yeah, Stephen, hi, and compliments this season to everyone listening. Look, we've known for a long time that they've got a major capacity shortage at ATNS. They've really been struggling to make sure or try and do their best to ensure that there are enough controllers in place to make sure that flights can operate safely. But that has meant that we've seen delays, we've seen the throttling of traffic, if you like, bigger intervals between departures, out of airports like OR Tambo as a result. And the wheels fell off spectacularly yesterday because of that. And when they had staff who they just had empty staffing positions, we're not quite sure what the reasons were, whether it was people calling in sick or whatever. That's what ATNS is saying. By sort of 9:30 yesterday, we started seeing the first delays of around about half an hour. By 12:30, they were up to 2 to 3 hours. And by mid-afternoon, they were 3 hours plus. And I just counted now, there were over 240 flights that were delayed leaving OR Tambo yesterday. And of course, that's meant that, by the end of the day, when crews finished their working day or couldn't fly any longer because they'd run out of flight duty time, we ended up with a number of aircraft and crews out of position for this morning's flight. So then we had more delays earlier today that had to be worked through. And I think it's going to take a couple of more days for this to finally all be resolved. And we know that in addition to that, there was a thunderstorm yesterday afternoon, but these delays and the throttling of traffic at OR Tambo started nearly 3.5, 4 hours before that, and ATNS notified all the airlines yesterday morning saying, we're doing this because of the traffic, and we've seen the weather forecast for thunderstorms. Even if the thunderstorm doesn't materialize, we're still going to continue with the traffic constraints around Johannesburg.
So, this is in a way a classic worst-case scenario. Massive travel day yesterday. Lots of people trying to come back, especially into Johannesburg. I would imagine perhaps one of the contributing causes was they hadn't wanted delays earlier in the festive season, and so they'd made sure everybody was ready for that, and this was the sort of final big day. And in the end, you just run out of people. It all builds on itself.
Yeah, it does, and we don't know. We haven't obviously got visibility of how they manage their staffing roster. The bottom line is they should never allow for there to be a capacity gap like that. We should never reach this sort of situation. And, I spoke to one airline today, Airlink, got some of their numbers. They had initially in the morning 31 flights delayed out of OR Tambo, but the knock-on effect that triggered meant another 69 flights delayed throughout the rest of the day, and the average delay was about 75 minutes. And then on top of that, they had 5 aircraft that had to divert because of that thunderstorm. 4 of them went to Gaborone and 1 went to Durban. But I'm aware a number of other airlines had similar problems, similar impact. Roughly half of their flights affected yesterday.
ATNS, in the headlines a lot last year, you and I had several conversations about it, says it's making progress in fixing itself. It's, it's upfront about the fact it needs more people. Do you see any progress? Do you see it moving in the right direction at least?
I think, the management are trying very hard, but, even as of today, and I heard this morning, there's, there are offers being made to people who are currently employed at ATNS to by air navigation service providers in other parts of the world. There's a global shortage of those skills, experienced people are being offered top dollar to move. So I anticipate we're going to probably see some more people leaving before we get more people joining. And then on top of that, we spoke last year about the suspension of all these instrument flight procedures, and although they've made some progress in reinstating the ones that they suspended in July 2024, in the last 3 months they've suspended many more because they didn't get to revalidate them before they expired. The most recent ones even on the 9th of December for Johannesburg and for Cape Town.
So what does it need now? Obviously, in the end, these things always boil down to the same thing. This is clearly an entity that would need more money for a start.
It needs more money. I think, I think the minister and her advisory team maybe need to cast the net a little wider in terms of speaking to people about where are the problems, what's really going on. For now, they've been quite confined to listening to what ATNS tells them, but maybe they should be also listening, and hearing suggestions from outside that. I think we've also got, this is not ATNS's problem, but the South African Civil Aviation Authority ultimately has to approve everything and everyone all the air traffic controllers have to be licensed by the South African Civil Aviation Authority. And from what I'm hearing, they're running into some ATNS are running into some roadblocks with people they'd like to hire to become airspace designers and procedure designers because their qualifications or current licenses are not recognized by the South Africa. And so the CAA is asking them to jump through some more hoops of fire.
Sure. Thank you very much indeed. Lyndon Burns, Managing Director of Plane Talking. You do get a sense in a way, just listening to that things at ATNS are still creaking a bit, that they have not been able to do everything they need to be. And clearly there is a lot more work to be done. I was lucky enough not to be stuck in all of that yesterday. I'm sure some people traveling home on the roads have some stories to tell as well about, how positive or negative that might well have been. But also, we really should not have another year of air traffic navigation services story. Well, with just hours to go until the end of 2025, there was an announcement from Canal Plus that 12 channels owned by Warner Brothers Discovery, including CNN and Cartoon Network, would remain on DSTV. There had been a warning to subscribers that the channels would be removed because Warner Brothers and Canal Plus could not reach an agreement. Tinus Ferreira's expert on the TV industry and a critic. Tinus, good evening. I remember speaking to you at the end of last year, and you said it would probably come down to the last minute, and in the end they would probably reach an agreement. That's exactly what happened. What do you think drove them there in the end?
In the run-up, I asked both sides multiple times if this multi-choice and Warner Bros. Discovery negotiating, or is it Canal Plus? Turns out it was Canal Plus. Turns out that it wasn't really about Africa, it was more about Europe. Canal Plus sort of superseded and took over from MultiChoice, and because they wanted to negotiate a better deal or expansion of their streaming service, HBO Max, as well as the same sort of continuation, new carriage deals for their channels across Europe and also into new territories, new countries like Belgium and Austria, they sort of lumped the Africa, meaning South Africa part of the rights deal into the broader European deal as a subset. So they kind of played a little bit hardball in that way. It wasn't just sort of the Africa deals that they were looking at renegotiating. It was actually sort of a bigger part of their business in Europe as well, where Canal Plus is obviously based as a French company.
So, I mean, this was in the end around the fact that DSTV's new owners have scale. And that scale really works if you're dealing with a company, even one the size of Warner Brothers.
Yes, and I actually have another shocker that I can tell you now. I haven't even reported about it yet, but breaking news is that this does not include the continuation of HBO and Warner Brothers content like the films and TV shows for Showmax. So that content is starting to disappear from Showmax, which I think is very bad for MultiChoice and Canal Plus, since they've poured literally billions with a B into starting that or relaunching that streaming service. And what Warner has told me is that they are still negotiating now with Canal Plus for a separate agreement for Showmax. I've asked until what the deadline is for the two sides for this, and I didn't get an answer yet. And literally what I was told by Warner was that unless a new agreement is reached, and I quote, they say popular series such as Friends, Game of Thrones, The Last of Us, along with blockbuster films like Superman and Barbie, will continue to be unavailable on MultiChoice platforms. And I heard this afternoon from several Showmax subscribers who were like, oh, after Christmas, I wanted to continue watching the show. This just disappeared. That just disappeared. Shows that are gone are like Veep, The Wire, Game of Thrones, Insecure, Succession, Sopranos, Leftovers. Some of the newer titles that's also on Mnet, Penguin, IT Dairy, they are still available, and I will check whether they disappear. So it's almost like one of those MacGyver episodes where he sort of defused the bomb and the red digits stop, and then suddenly they continue to count down again. So we're once again in a countdown.
I love the way you put that. I presume for Warner Brothers, they know the value of that particular content. Quality content, they're the only ones with it. It's theirs. They made it. And as a result of that, they really, even against Canal Plus, have quite a lot of leverage for something like Showmax.
listen to this sentence also that they sent me literally just a few hours ago. In parallel, and I quote again, Warner Bros. Discovery is exploring alternative avenues to ensure consumers have future access to our world-class content from HBO and Warner Bros. Who's the alternative to DSTV? We have none. There's only streamers. So are they talking to maybe with Netflix in Africa or South Africa to put some of the HBO shows on there in the way that we've been able to see the Harry Potter films on Netflix? It's something that I'll track this week.
Sure. That is interesting. Tinus, I mean, I get a sense that this is a big year for the DSTV platform, owned as it is now by Canal+. It's been under intense pressure for a long time, no real changes. I would imagine if I were the person in charge for Canal+, that I would be looking at making quite a lot of changes and suddenly having to do that without some of the content I might have been relying upon.
Who knows whether they're going to keep Showmax alive or whether they're going to discover a big gaping black hole that they sort of decide they're rather going to walk away with. Today is also quite coincidentally the 50th anniversary of the start of South African television, and then later in the year will be the 40th anniversary of Mnet. It will be, we'll have to see whether Mnet even still exists without HBO content or things like that on it. And a source told me over the weekend that the French owners are actually quite eager to impress. And I didn't say anything back, but I just thought, well, what so far they haven't really impressed or made a positive impression.
So there are options now. You could get a lot cheaper. That may be something they have to do. Maybe become a sort of streaming service that competes a little bit on price. They are more expensive than others. Or they're going to have to do something extraordinary with the live sport when, particularly, I suppose, in our terms, the rugby season gets going.
I so agree with you. They will have to do some fundamental sort of house cleaning or reorganizing or restructuring, because all of like the trinkets and bells and whistles, they will say, oh, we're opening channels for free for premium subscribe or for lower tiered subscribers who can watch the same as premium subscribers, or they will do this or that. I mean, none of that really fundamentally changes the value option of how DSTV currently looks and structures. It's really going to shape up to be a very interesting year to see whether they are maybe going to spin off all of their sport content as a separate package, or really do big things like that to try and sort of stop the hammering of subscribers and to sort of re-endear themselves to subscribers who've already cut the cord and gone away.
And I mean, in the same time, in the States, because of the Paramount issue and Netflix, I mean, the whole industry could actually be turned on its head a little bit. This could suddenly be a very consequential year for streaming.
I thought 2025 was so tumultuous, and just sort of like look at how this year's already shaping up. I cannot even imagine. Over the weekend, I thought, I have to do sort of like a trend story for what's happening and coming for South African television for the year. And I actually thought, whatever I come up with, I'm probably going to be surprised come December.
And then, obviously, Tinus, I mean, so many other things are going to be going on at this point. In the end, the story actually has become as interesting in the streaming industry as some of the stuff they've been showing.
They are consolidating. They are continuing this one-upmanship of more and more content, which is not churning out more and more shows and big budgets on content spent, which is obviously unsustainable. We will have to see more of these mergers between the streamers. We're going to see what's going to happen, whether Paramount or Netflix gobbles up HBO, what happens to HBO Max, which is a streamer we don't get here in South Africa yet. So, yeah, I think it's going to be very stormy weather for the year ahead for TV and film.
Tinus Ferreira, thank you so much. Expert on the TV industry, as you can hear, and a TV critic as well.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes.
Well, you've heard about the big fuel price decrease. You've heard about the increase in platinum and gold prices. You've heard the bullish outlook for the year. If that wasn't enough good news for you, well, then a report on MoneyWeb today pointing out that Eskom has excess generation capacity. Basically, it switched off over 13,000 megawatts of electricity generation capacity because it has too much. Also, I must just point out, because of the holiday season, Jose Moleshe is an energy expert. Jose, good evening, and thanks so much for your time. There was a time when I sort of used to dread the holiday season. It meant Eskom would do intense maintenance. We would have big, endless debates. Will there be enough electricity for Christmas dinner? Now, suddenly, we see how things have really changed.
Good evening, Stephen. Indeed, things have really changed, and they've changed for the positive. And so we are seeing now excess capacity that's available, particularly during the holiday season when the demand is relatively low, with factories and industries closed at that time.
How much of this is about the drop in demand, and how much of it is about people getting the electricity from somewhere else? I suppose what I'm really asking is how much of it is seasonal. I mean, I'm sure anyone driving through some of the rural areas, as I was during the holiday period, I mean, you see solar panels in so many places now.
It's largely, there is a contribution of different sources that are coming in, that no one can run away from that. But during the summer period, so in the summer period, you have a lot of excess capacity, especially during the holidays. This is mainly because, as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of the factories are closed, so the demand is relatively low. And so there's that capacity available. So what Eskom has been saying with some of the excess capacity is that this is the reason why the minister says there's a need to improve performance on the distribution side, so that some of this electricity that's available can go to the distribution side. And I mean that by that, the load reduction that is happening. So that's part of that. Yes, there is, of course, people who are putting in their own systems. But remember that some of the people that are putting in solar panels, when there's no availability, they still back up through Eskom.
So if you look at where Eskom is now, and I mean, I remember we used to get, usually during the winter period, we'd be told what the annual peak production was, the highest number or the highest amount of electricity Eskom had produced in that year. Do you expect that that figure is never going to go up, that Eskom's actual annual peak production, I hope I've got the term correct, will decline a little bit? There's a lot more electricity being produced by independent power producers, by wind farms I drove through over the weekend, by various other places. I mean, just Eskom itself is going to will probably never generate as much electricity as it did.
It depends what happens on the demand side. If there are industries that are cropping up, then there will still be demand for the electricity. But if the industries are shutting down, as you know, some are, then there will be excess capacity. But remember then, in winter again, in summer we typically also tend to do a lot more maintenance to take advantage of the fact that there's less demand, and then in winter there's relatively more demand. So they also play with that. So those are the three elements that come into play.
You made the point, and it's an important point, that Eskom has to keep some baseload capacity. It has to be able to turn on the coal-fired power stations in case there's, bad weather, stops the production of solar electricity, cloud or rain or whatever it is. With more and more electricity coming from solar, is it going to be more important for Eskom's weather predictions to be accurate? You can't just switch on those coal-fired power stations at the flick of a switch. They take about 18 hours, if I remember correctly, to warm up. To put it another way, could we have, the next time we have load shedding, it won't be because Eskom doesn't have enough electricity. It might be because someone got the weather wrong.
No, the system operator is actually well renowned, especially the South Africa one, for managing the system up to a second in terms of the demand supply. So when there's excess demand that it cannot be met, they have to switch off. When there's additional supply required, then they have to put back on. The coal-fired power plants generally generate for 24/7. Unless there's too much capacity, then they have to be put down. But they generally generate. And then when there's excess demand, then they use the peakers to meet that demand. So it depends on but the system operator literally minute by minute monitors what happens, and they're on point on that.
I mean, it is still amazing to me how quickly electricity has turned around. And it does make you wonder if this could have happened a lot earlier with the right management. It's the only sort of frustrating aspect of it.
I mean, most of us had been saying that, but no one cared to listen, that the system does have enough capacity. The problem was that the maintenance of the plants, the running of the system in general, and just generally within Eskom, some of the issues that related to financing. So government came to the party at some point, helping Eskom with the debt. They did not do that for a very long time. At some point, they have 7 board members that were not vacant board seats. And so all of those different things, finally, with a willpower from a political point of view to resolve them, have been resolved. But they could have been resolved earlier, in my view.
Jose, thanks so much. Good to talk to you. Jose Malesha is an energy expert. So much to think about with electricity and so much positive news coming out of it as well.
The Money Show.
Business Books.
One of the most enjoyable things I was able to do over the holiday period was to spend quite a bit of time immersed in books. I use an e-book reader, but still, I went through several books. One book, The War That Ended Peace, The Road to 1914 by Margaret Macmillan, reminded me of something that I found a little bit disturbing. That before the start of the First World War, Germany and the UK were each other's biggest trading partners. Does it remind you of who the world's 2 biggest trading partners are right now? Of course, the US and China. I found that a little bit disturbing. Someone else who I suspect spent his festive season immersed in books, and he decided to take a deeper look into the world of journalism, was Peter du Toit. He's the assistant editor for investigations at News 24. He's also the author of the book The Dark Prince, the unauthorized biography of Paul Mashatile. Peter, good evening. You spent your holiday reading a book called A Good Life. It's the memoir of the legendary American journalist Ben Bradlee. He, of course, was the editor of the Washington Post when it first broke the Watergate scandal. He was kind of at the center of journalism during a very important period in U.S. politics. What was it that drew you to that book?
Good evening, Stephen. Yes, and good to be speaking to you early in the year with all the turmoil that seems to come with the end of the previous one and the start of every new year. Look, Ben Bradlee, as you correctly pointed out, is one of the biggest and most legendary newspaper editors in the world. He edited the Washington Post between 1965 and 1991, and during that period helped to elevate the Washington Post, which really was a flailing local newspaper when he took over the editorship in 1965, to rival to the point where it rivaled the New York Times as a national newspaper in the United States, and certainly as a paper now that while it might not have the reach and the size of the New York Times, certainly is considered one of the world's great papers. And during his tenure as editor-in-chief or executive editor, as they call it in the United States, he oversaw, obviously, the Watergate coverage into corruption in the U.S. government, into corruption in the Nixon administration, and then he oversaw the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which showed that the U.S. government lied to the U.S. public over a period of time in relation to the real state of affairs in Vietnam. So I really enjoyed it from a journalist point of view. Enjoyed, just getting affirmation about what the job is that we do, why we do it, how we as journalists hold people and people with power specifically to account, how we hold those in political power to account. And Bradlee was someone that was able to navigate some of our, biggest stories over the last half century or so. And it was fascinating to get an inside look into that.
I mean, if you think about sort of the Nixon era that you were reading about, and you think maybe, I suppose, to an extent, the Zuma era, someone forced to kind of resign through sort of democratic processes. I mean, there's some very interesting parallels. I mean, they did very different things, of course, but very interesting parallels.
Absolutely. And it's you mentioned the book about the First World War, and I read that same book, and it was fascinating to see, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, doesn't it? And we might think that the Zuma era might be abnormal. You might think that the Nixon era might have been abnormal, but in the end, when politicians are given and when they assume political power, it tends to have an adverse effect on people's judgment. And Nixon was fascinating because it wasn't in as much the deed of the break-in at the Watergate Hotel that sank Nixon. It was the lie. It was the cover-up. It was the persistent denials of the reportage in the Washington Post. And Stephen, what was fascinating was that Ben Bradley, who was the editor and the subject of his book, he was very close to politicians. He was very close to John F. Kennedy. He became friends with Kennedy before Kennedy was even a presidential candidate. And he found it very difficult to navigate his friendship with Kennedy when Kennedy was president. And you and I, who've been in this business for a while, we need to navigate the spaces between ourselves and those who have power, whether it's economic power, cultural power, or political power, very adroitly, because it sometimes does become difficult because you need to manage sources, you need to manage people who you speak to, but you also need to understand that you do the job on behalf of the public and you are never friends with the people that you write about.
I mean, I find that's one of the interesting tensions about journalism, and journalists and politicians can actually be quite similar. Bradley spent a lot of time reporting on U.S. presidents or editing the reporting on U.S. presidents. We're in a completely different era now. And I mean, you would have had journalists in the Oval Office in the Trump administration. Yeah. I mean, I kind of often look at the U.S. sort of journalistic pack and I think two things. Firstly, Trump is loving it. He's absolutely loving the attention. That's why he does it. And secondly, if I were a journalist there, I don't think I'd have any other choice but to do what they do. I find that very disconcerting.
I agree with you, and Bradley was very firm. When Kennedy died, there was a moment where he realized that their relationship was not one of friendship. That Kennedy used him, and that he might have believed that he was friends with Kennedy, but they never really were. And it was the moment when Kennedy's body arrived back in Washington. He rushed to the medical or the military hospital outside of Washington, D.C., because him and his wife waited for Jackie Kennedy to arrive back in Washington. And the first thing she said to him was, "This is not to print in your paper." And then he realized that she never considered him a friend and that there never really was a proper friendship. So after that, following that, the Johnson years, the Nixon years, the Reagan years, the start of the Clinton presidency or the Clinton era, he was very adamant and firm about the fact that the Washington Post, the journalists that work there, the Bernsteins, the Woodwards, Bradley himself, who was the editor, they were not there to be liked. They were there. Their job, pure and simple, was to get the truth out. It doesn't matter what the administration thought. It doesn't matter who was in power. Their relationship was with their readers, and that's where it started and ended. And I think you're right. I think the press in the U.S. seem to be browbeaten, Stephen. They seem to be beaten into submission by not only by the hard-handedness with which the Trump administration is handling the media, but also by the pure velocity and the speed with which things are changing. It's almost impossible to take a step back, it seems to me, and take stock. But the Bradley book was fascinating. He led a colorful life, covered the biggest stories, and I particularly enjoyed, obviously, the parts about Watergate, about using your sources, about when to use anonymous sources, when not to use anonymous sources. And the fact that they made mistakes. They made mistakes in Watergate. They were pilloried for that, but in the end, they won the war.
I mean, in a way, often the question around journalism is: does this story move the needle one way or another? Yes. And in the case of Trump right now, he gives the impression of having very strong political support. And I remember the same with Zuma and Nixon. We mustn't forget, won an overwhelming majority in his second term. I mean, overwhelming. And suddenly political support can change almost like that. It did for Zuma. It did for Nixon. I mean, it might for Trump. I have no idea. Venezuela might even be the start of it. But that also informs your reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you refer to the fact whether or not the reporting moves the needle. I think the Watergate was a very good example of persistency in reporting over a number of years, where they broke a number of big stories, but it didn't really seem to break the camel's back, as it were. And then then it accelerates. Like Hemingway said, when do you go bankrupt? Slowly and then suddenly. And I think if I can refer back to our own reporting at News 24 over the last 2 years with the Babita Deokaran case, Jeff Wicks broke a number of big stories which didn't really seem to move the needle. And once the Kat Matala stuff started getting momentum, then it really picked up. So it's about consistency and persistency and doggedness in reporting. You might break a big story 1 week and it can be it can be a sensation for a day or two, but it's about that consistency and that persistency over many years. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from this wonderfully colourful Bradley book that I read.
Your own book around Paul Mashatile, the Deputy President, published last year, I imagine in many stockings over the weekend. Have you had much reaction to it? Did you get any, statements from his people? Did you get people saying, listen?
You get informal approaches, Stephen. Yeah, which I did get. There were some informal sidlings up, questioning the motives and questioning the contents of the book, and in fact saying, it's maybe time for a discussion with Mashatile's people around that. So it seems to have hit the spot in the presidency, and it certainly seems to have hit the spot in the ANC. I did get some good feedback from ANC people saying, look, given what's in the book, but also given what reporting has been done, given the reporting that has been done over the last couple of years, he might not be the guy for the job. So it seems to have been read by the correct people, Stephen, and for that I'm grateful.
That's all you want sometimes. It's an impossible question, but do you think he's still the front runner to be president after President Cyril Ramaphosa? And there used to be a time when the only thing you had to take into account was dynamics within the ANC. It's not quite like that anymore. I think it's still hard for me to imagine the next president comes from another party. But that's no longer fantasy, it's just science fiction.
Absolutely. Look, it's interesting that the NGC, which was held in December a couple of weeks ago, really didn't give us a big indication as it used to do in the past. You'd recall in 2005, it was very clear that Jacob Zuma was making a very strong comeback. But it didn't really pan out this way a couple of weeks ago. I do think that Mashatile still has the strongest organization. We've heard names like Toko Didiza being bandied about, a couple of other names that might be pushed forward. But Mashatile has the advantage of incumbency at the deputy presidency level, at government level, and also at party level. He has the Gauteng machinery behind him, and he's made strong overtures to some key provinces like KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. So I think he is the presumptive front runner. But Stephen, we're in January. You know as well as I do that predicting politics is a mug's game. Things can change in a matter of weeks. So this year will be a big year. The ANC's elective conference comes around next December in 2027. Let's see what Mashatile does. But I do think, as I argue in the book, that if he wins it, it's something akin to a Zuma 2.0.
Peter du Toit, thank you so much. Really do appreciate the time. Assistant Editor for Investigations at News 24. His book is called The Dark Prince, the unauthorized biography of Paul Mashatile. The book he was talking about is entitled A Good Life. It's by Ben Bradley, the former editor of The Washington Post. Peter du Toit, thanks so much for your time on The Money Show.
Thank you, Stephen. It feels surreal to be on the opposite side of an interview table, but privilege is all mine. Thank you.
Do you see yourself as new-ish, or do you feel, a job like that, I don't know if you ever feel comfortable doing it, frankly, but do you still feel new?
New ended after day one. It's very much a case of you get right stuck in.
Yes.
News, as you know, waits for no one. So really got straight down to admit the team. Newspaper has to come out every day. So news far gone.
It's one of the most amazing things about radio too, actually, is that you don't have time to be nervous or to feel about being new. You take over and suddenly you have an edition to put out and you're responsible for it. I imagine that gets you going very quickly.
Exactly. And that's both the beauty and the fear of being an editor is once your name's there, something goes wrong, your name is mud.
You're the one, I suppose, who goes to court. Let's start at the very beginning. And I did what I often do nowadays when I'm trying to find out where did someone get their start. And go onto LinkedIn and I have a look. And I noticed and I don't mean to be rude, but your first journalism job was at independent newspapers. I should point out it was a very different independent newspapers to what independent newspapers has unfortunately become.
Yeah, well, as you're alluding to, I started right just before that transition. So I got my start straight out of varsity. I was straight during varsity actually. Started my postgrad. Had to get a kind of job. Had no intentions of really getting into journalism at the time full time, but I was fortunate enough to get a part-time job working at the Star as a sub when I started my honors degree. And I really enjoyed it, really got into it. After about pretty clean year, I think, some of the transition took place. And as you know, there was a bit of a bloodbath there. And I was one of the names, and I went on my merry way.
When you were growing up, I mean, you say journalism wasn't something you necessarily wanted to do. Most of the good journalists I know didn't grow up wanting to be journalists, let me just say. Was there, how did it end up that you ended up in journalism?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long story. I mean, I had no intentions, as you say, of getting into journalism, but it was something I was constantly surrounded by. My father was a journalist, worked in most of the national titles.
All right.
My mom, some of my earliest memories are her sending me into the corner shops to go buy either Mail and Guardian or the Sunday Times. As a youngster, I would always grab them, read the sports section straight away. As I grew a bit older, of course, I graduated to some of the rest of the sections of the paper. And my parents were always very willing to get me any sort of print publication or magazine when I was younger. Really kind of fed that itch. So, even when I was young and that's a gaming magazine, and then it was football, etc., etc. So that sort of reading and a love of journalism and a love of nonfiction in general always stayed with me. When I entered university, I wouldn't even really call it a dream. I'd call it more of a fantasy at the time of being an academic. As I said, once I got into the journalism world, that kind of real world itch really hit me, and never looked back from there.
Clearly, if you're as a younger person, as a child, reading newspapers, no matter which section it is, there's a sense of curiosity that you must have had. Not everybody has that. It took me a while to realize that I was unusual in that I kept asking questions and I couldn't stop. Was it the same for you? This idea that I need to know a little bit more. Well, this looks interesting. I need to know a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, and as my 4-year-old says why all the time, I can see she has inherited that very much. But I guess that's the beauty of reading, right? It's always easy to ask that question, and I think that's those of us that have that naturally end up in journalism because we want to ask those questions and we want to ask why. And I think even going now, I'd say that's where all good journalism is born, not just reporting the news, but asking that why and explaining it to the reader as well.
You mentioned that your father actually had been in newspapers. What kind of community were you growing up in at the time, and when was this all?
There would have been, a number of communities actually. It's a bit of a difficult question to answer. Broadly speaking, born and bred in Joburg. But as most Joburgers know, you're a bit of a mutt if you move around. So, the earlier stage of my life spent in Bez Valley, which I think is a great reflective neighborhood of what Joburg can be, or at least at the time. Then moved around a lot. My mother and father were separated, so sort of at any given time got to spend time in different neighborhoods. So on my mother's side, it would be spend much of my youth in Sandringham, more on the kind of Edenvale side of things. My father moved around a lot, so that exposed me to lots of different parts of Joburg. So from Yeovil to Troyville, Kensington, everywhere. Growing up, then again, also kind of I got my first flat in Troyville. Moved on to Norwood, and I'm now gone right sold out to the northern suburbs.
Don't we all in the end? I knew Bez Valley. I grew up very close to there, actually, and sort of grew up knowing Kensington and strangely Sandringham. I had a friend who lived there very well. So you went and you studied at Wits. And was it politics that you were studying?
Yeah. So I think like anybody who doesn't know exactly what they want to do with their lives, you do a BA. and you get to do a little bit of everything from psychology to history. Ultimately, the majors I settled on were political studies and philosophy. Again, the sort of fantasy at the time, I think, was to be a philosopher. So I did my honors in that. Then again, once you kind of get that real world experience, and all respect and love to my philosophy colleagues, but I felt there was a bit kind of more tangible, real world worth to be had doing politics. So I switched to that for my master's degree.
And I mean, to do a master's in it, you must start to be really curious about it. I mean, if you're going to do that, you have to be very interested in what you're doing to sort of take it that seriously at that level.
Yeah, I guess so. And then you kind of go to journalism, and I think it sort of it turns you off politics.
Yeah,
I
and politicians.
But I mean, exactly. As you know, it's a bit of a game. But when you're actually studying it, it's called political studies, or it used to be called political science, right? So it really is kind of the science behind it. And at the time, I did my dissertation on party funding or political party funding, which in the early 2010s,
very prescient.
As you know, was a very important issue. I mean, at the time, it was clear to see. I mean, as you know, that was a major issue, and I mean, my vote counts had already started with their significant action. Of course, a few years later, we would actually get to see this pass. But as we see, it's still an issue. I mean, we just had doubling of the thresholds last year, and there's still a lot of questions around that. And again, my vote count in particular has a lot of concerns.
No, I mean, there's still a long going on around that. Was there anyone in particular who sort of influenced you in journalism? I mean, I don't know if it was your dad or if there was someone else who you maybe bumped into, or a group of people, or a particular time. We haven't yet started on your career at the Mail and Guardian, so we've got a long way to go. But I mean, was there a particular person who you thought, actually, this person's had a big influence?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. I mean, as you mentioned, my father specifically. I mean, he took a lot of pride in sort of training me, especially. I mean, he was a revised editor, and he took a lot of pride really in kind of making sure that I got nothing. You know, he wanted to be any journalist or any editor to be unimpeachable, and he really kind of drove that into me, and that's something that stayed with me. Again, we're kind of skipping ahead, as you say, on the story then, but I mean, I've worked with a number of journalists who I've been blessed to work with a number of journalists who have really influenced me throughout the years. In terms of the time period, I would say my formative years of really kind of shaping me into who I want to be the Mail and Guardian when we had Khadija Patel as editor, and I worked very closely with Burgard Tromp at the time. He was deputy editor. He's now the convener of AIGC, of course. And yeah, look, I mean, there's a number of people I could name. I mean, Sipho Kings as well, for instance, when he stepped in after that period as editor at the M&G. I think any good editor really kind of drills lessons into their journalists. And I think to this day, even if it's 10 or so years later, when you write something or you go on radio, whatever the case is, their voice is always hovering over you. And I think in this craft, it's always wise to seek out these sort of mentors. I mean, even now, far more recently, I had the privilege of meeting Peter Bruce, who, as you know, is one of my esteemed predecessors. And and
I'm sure you'll have a view one way or another.
He always has a view. You don't have to ask twice. Yeah.
Yes.
But no, I mean, he's been extremely helpful. And I mean, anything solicited or not, he's only a phone call away.
So you go to the Mail and Guardian, and I mean, I mean, I'm always very sad to think of the Mail and Guardian now, not because anyone there's done anything wrong or bad or poor or in any way, just because of circumstance, because of what sort of happened around it, you know. I think to be a weekly newspaper now is very, very hard. And unless you have huge resources, to compete on a sort of website basis is also very, very hard. You know, there's a reason why News 24 has so few rivals, because it requires huge resources. But when you were there, to sort of watch, to be a part of a newsroom that mattered, you know, moved the dial in South Africa, that must have been quite fun.
I mean, certainly. I mean, it's exactly that, right? It's something that mattered. And I mean, while I agree with your broad assessment, I think it still very much does matter. And
no, sure.
And I've got a lot of love for it. But yeah, moving there at the time, I mean, it was a dream. I still remember the kind of surreal experience of going into this Rosebank office at the time and everywhere was, I mean, everyone had these huge sort of Mac screens, and
yes,
it just felt like this fancy sort of new age place, like you were walking into the Washington Post or the New York Times. And again, journalism that was done and has been done for years, it's been absolutely fantastic. And just the, sort of reception you got as a journalist as well when you went to go speak to someone and you said, I'm coming from the Mail and Guardian. I mean, people really revered that and wanted to speak to you and respected what you had to say.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing. It opens the door, doesn't it? If you say Luke Feltham, someone might go, who? Exactly. But if you say Luke Feltham, Mail and Guardian, the door suddenly opens.
Yeah, and I think, sorry to cut into you there, I was just going to say, I think as much as that's something that we'll forget, I think when a lot of journalists and a lot of it's spoken about how easy it is to, kind of be a journalist on the internet these days, but people don't sort of realize that that name still carries that clout, especially when you go to a business or you're a politician and you say, okay, please, can you give me 30 minutes of this time? I mean, people underestimate how difficult that is to actually call someone up out of the blue, right? And say, okay, please, can we have this interview? Can we record this? Can we sit in front of a camera, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, credibility is everything. People want to know they'll be treated fairly, and that's what the brand really does. Is it does that? We need to. I mean, during the time you were at the Mail and Guardian, you were the online editor for a while, and then you became the editor before you moved to Business Day. And this is during that period was really the time when we sort of saw this massive process of moving away from newspapers to journalism all being online. And for the moment, I do just want to stick to sort of what I would call word journalism, so textual journalism. So I mean, going away from I'm not talking about video and stuff yet. It's been, looking back, I mean, it was obvious going to happen, but it still happened quite quickly. I mean, I know, I think there are plenty of young people now who might be listening to this. And if you say, well, actually, you used to get your news from a thing that was printed and distributed in that way, they sort of look at you as if you're a bit mad.
Yeah, look, I mean, I have plenty of thoughts on this. I mean, the first would be that I think print journalism, I like to think of print journalism as still very much alive. And yes, I do have a bias because I work at a newspaper and I've always loved print journalism my whole life. But I think it brings something unique to society. It's the newspaper that's shared around at a family table or on a bus. And I don't think we should ever underestimate how important that is to our democracy. And I try to always not be defeatist on this because I think there's countless publications around the world that have probably done themselves a huge disservice by almost putting in place a self-fulfilling prophecy that this thing is going to die, and that kind of mindset takes hold and creeps through your entire publication. That being said, of course, you need to acknowledge the reality of where people are consuming their news. And the Mail and Guardian actually, interestingly, that was the first news outlet to first launch a website. And that served it well for very long time. Unfortunately, I would say within the Mail and Guardian's case, and just about everyone else, actually, it's the sort of traditional advertising models that were far easier to get when print publication was involved. In vogue. No one has really figured out a way to make that as profitable.
And that's the difficult part. So do you think then, are you a journalism optimist or are you a journalism pessimist? And I can go in both directions depending on whether I've had lunch yet.
I'm certainly an optimist. It is, again, I can recognize some of the difficulties and some of the realities, but again, I'm a big believer in self-fulfilling prophecies, and I think we have to believe in this craft. We will, as a country, we will be doomed if it goes under. We're lucky that we still got some extremely strong journalism outlets out there, and it's something that we need to protect. And if we don't value our own work, then who will?
We're speaking to Luke Feltham. He's the editor at Business Day. He's telling us about his career on My Money this evening on The Money Show. Luke, you and I actually, we're not sort of rivals or competitors, I don't think, but we're in the same business. We both do business journalism. What do you think is the role of business journalism right now? I mean, in some ways, I think it's the same it's always been, to sort of illuminate and understand and explain what's going on. But in some ways, maybe it does change.
No, Steve, I'm fully with you there. As we were just kind of discussing off air, and you told me a very interesting fact that you don't mention actual numbers on the show.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating and I think very useful because, look, business is a complicated thing. And the role of the business journalist is to explain it as evenly as possible and as simply as possible. And business, like any other subject, if you as a writer are unable to understand it, the reader is not going to either.
And Business Day right now, big websites, print publications. Still, if you look at, consistently sort of held its position for quite a long time. Very long, very important track record, of course. What do you think the sort of role of Business Day should be?
Look, I see Business Day. It has always been, and I hope it can continue to be. It's just a must-read paper. We've had a couple of sightings of President Cyril Ramaphosa, for instance, carrying the Business Day under his arm as he gets into the plane, and that's really more than anything what we love. It has to be from politicians to business people to academics. It has to be the must-read paper or must-read publication, whether that's online newspaper, whether you're consuming us on social media, video formats as well.
A lot of that's about curation, isn't it? You've got to make sure that someone can read just that publication and they know everything that matters. Anyone can go and find all the facts they want online nowadays, but that curation must be very important.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I love about Business Day, apart from business being in the name. It's a publication that really reflects South African society at large. Of course, companies and markets is a strong section in the paper, but we've got very strong news journalists. We've got a strong politics team. We're occasionally feature segments such as motoring, for instance. Sport is on our back page and our website every day. So I'd like to believe it's a bit of a misconception. I find sometimes that people think sort of Business Day is just for the business inclined, and at the very least, business does not equal boring.
Mm-hmm. The future of business journalism, and I've always thought running a business without knowing facts is impossible. You're going to make the wrong decision, and that is why publications like The Economist and The Financial Times, with a sort of global audience, are doing really quite well at the moment. Is that simple fact? Do you think that alone keeps business journalism alive?
Knowing the facts.
Knowing the facts, yeah.
Certainly a start. But again, if we look at those two publications that you mentioned, there's a far greater reason I think that they have that broad appeal, and they have figured out a formula to speak to people with that global audience. And again, if we're kind of talking now long-term planning, I would absolutely love to see sort of Business Day mentioned in that in the same sentence. I'm a Financial Times subscriber. I read it just about every day. Settle down on the weekend and read FT Weekend, and I absolutely love it. But at the same time, something sort of always at the back of my mind, thinking I would love a publication from South Africa or Africa at large to really kind of grip that global audience. And again, as much as I love those two publications, at the end of the day, we're allowing some offices in London to set the agenda. And I think not just Business Day, but there's other really good publications out there with really good teams, and I would love to, especially in this global moment, love to see us all kind of reach beyond our current audiences.
I've been fascinated by watching a big push into video from many other publications that I thought would never go there. The Economist has been doing it recently. I know others do. I'd always just in my own head, and maybe I'm just conservative, thought, you can't remember anything from a video. And if information is key, I can't think of a more efficient way to take it in more quickly than reading it, because it takes so long for someone to say something. Most people can talk at around 3 words a second. Most people can read far faster than that. Do you think that video, the sort of publication in video that's how it's going to go? It's going to take over the world in that way? I find it hard to believe, especially in business journalism.
Yeah, look, I'm like you. I'm very much old school at heart, and I believe the art of reading will always be there, and the written word. That being said, I like to think of it as journalism is journalism. And if you get your facts down, you do your proper reporting, whether you get it on a format of the written word or on video or on just listening podcasts, people are still going to find value in that. And right now, again, I think the ideal way, and I think newsrooms should all be looking at that, is how to get the journalism that you do on the ground, how to translate that into as many formats as possible. I mean, we all have financial restrictions. It's a difficult environment, as we alluded to earlier, but as more and more of these technologies become accessible, that's something we can do with minimal cost. And that's certainly something that we're looking at Business Day, is it doesn't have to be a case of sacrificing the print product, doesn't have to be a case of sacrificing the written word on a website. But what we can do is take our work now, translate it into different forms, and get it viewed by as many people as possible, which as a journalist should really be your goal in the first place.
I mean, I've been fascinating watching with the impact of AI on social media. I mean, it seems to be killing social media, and there's a wonderful irony to it, because there's just so much AI slop. You sort of have to trawl through pages of LinkedIn to find anything genuine, and even then it's not often very genuine, really. Could AI kill journalism too? Sometimes, people talk about the death of the internet because it's all just rubbish.
I mean, that's the big question that everyone has been asking for the past year or two, right? And it's not just it's not just journalists. Everyone wants to know if their jobs are going to be taken by AI. Again, I choose to take the optimistic view of that, and I think that people are fatigued by that constant AI. And what is becoming a very inauthentic world in many ways, especially the digital environment. And I think there will be a hankering and a desire to get towards content that is more analog. And I mean, again, that's a big reason why I think journalism is not going anywhere. And there's a lot of value still, both in print products and the written word online.
Luke, thanks very much indeed for coming in. I know it's very early in the year to be doing that, so thank you. Luke Feltham is the editor at Business Day. Luke, thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve.